So you want to buy a laser, but you're not sure what to get. Let me help. I'm Brandon, and over the years, I've been able to test tons of different lasers, from small open gantry diode machines like this, to huge lasers that are basically the size of a car. When I was buying my very first laser, there's a ton of stuff that I wish I knew then, and that is the goal of this video, because I want to send you in the right direction for the type of laser that's going to be the best fit for you, because there's not going to be just one laser that's going to be the perfect fit for everybody. All right, so to help narrow down the type of machine that you need to get, I'm gonna ask you one question, and that is, do you want to do anything with metal? Mainly, do you want to engrave on metal? If the answer is yes, then we'll come back to you at the end of this video, and there's actually gonna be timestamps down below where we'll hit a bunch of different categories of different types of lasers, and pretty much anything to do with metal. We're gonna be talking about infrared laser beams, and most commonly, those are gonna be in fiber machines. Now, if your answer was no, we're basically talking about two different types of lasers. One is going to be a diode and one is going to be a CO2 glass tube. And to kind of help explain the type of one that you might want, let's have a little science corner. So laser is actually an acronym, and the L in laser stands for light. And light can come in a ton of different wavelengths, giving us all the colors on the spectrum. But that isn't the whole story, because that is just the visible spectrum of light. We also have wavelengths of light that are too long that we can't see, and we call that infrared. And then on the other end, we have light that is too short, and we call that ultraviolet light. Now, why this actually matters to you is the wavelength impacts the type of stuff that you can do. So we already talked about metal, and for metal, you typically are going to use a fiber laser, which drops in right here in the infrared spectrum. Usually it's around like 290 nanometers. That's the actual wavelength of the light. Now, going back to the low end, we do have UV lasers. I actually haven't been able to test those out. Those are nice though, because those are great for materials where you need to have cold markings, meaning that you really can't heat the material up to mark it because it's going to deform it. Like plastic is a really good example. Now that's going to get us to the two main laser types that we are going to be talking about. And the first is going to be a laser diode. This is actually a 10-watt module from xTool. These operate in the visible light range. That's actually why we have this protective covering on here. And especially over the last year, you've seen a lot of people put entire enclosures around these diode lasers, because when the light fires, you can definitely see it. It's actually pretty purple, and it's in like the 455 nanometer range. Now what's great about these is this is the laser, meaning I can just pick this thing up. So it is very, very portable. Now, obviously you have to put this on something that can move this around. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. And typically they're gonna be cheaper than their CO2 counterparts, and you're not gonna be able to go up in power as high as you definitely can with a CO2 unit. Really, the most practical ones I've seen is like 40 watts, which is really getting up there. I have tested out some units that are like 60 and 80 watts. Pretty much what they're doing is taking an individual diode and they're stacking them inside of here with a bunch of optics. And I think they're like around 5.5 watts each. So that's why you'll normally see these in wattages of like 5, 10, 20, and 40. It just depends on how many they have inside. There are a few different companies that can actually turn on and turn off different diodes, which gives you different wattages, which is handy because as you add in more optics, you're gonna get a thicker and thicker laser beam. So actually the lower watt diodes, this one is a 1.6 watt, is gonna have a much, much smaller laser beam versus this guy, which is 10. Now, if power is really what you're looking for, then a CO2 laser is the way to go. Those are still gonna be an IR laser because they're in the infrared spectrum, but they're gonna be much higher than that fiber source, which is 1090. This is like 10,600 nanometers, so a much, much longer laser beam. Now, the big benefit of CO2 lasers is they could potentially be a lot more powerful. So wattages will range on like the 40 to 50 on the low end to like 150 to 250 watts on the top end. So a lot more power than even the top end of the diodes. Another key difference of a CO2 machine is if you need to do anything clear, so etching like directly on glass or etching or cutting clear acrylic, you can't do that with a diode. So if clear acrylic or glass are what you need to do, then a CO2 is going to be the right one for you. Now, if you're not primarily doing metal and you don't need clear acrylic or glass, then the diode machines and the CO2 machines can potentially have a good bit of crossover. And I'm going to split these machines up into 5 main categories, which you can basically plot on this graph of power versus price. So we're going to start on the low end and kind of work our way all the way up to the top. All right, we're going to start with what you've already seen, and these are open diode machines. There's actually a lot of different versions and companies of all of these machines. So to help out, I've put all of these together in a big chart so you can compare compare the machines over a bunch of different attributes. Basically everything I have in here, I've either actually tested or I'm pretty familiar with the company and I've seen a lot of the stuff that they've done. I'll have links down below if you want to check any of these out. Pretty much all of these are affiliate links, which I have with pretty much all of the different companies. So I try to stay as unbiased as possible, but as always, make sure and do your own research. All right, so these open diode machines are pretty much that. It's a diode laser on like an open gantry XY system, where you have a few stepper motors that is gonna move this around in the X and the Y. There is no enclosure whatsoever. That is the massive, massive drawback with these style machines. So you're gonna be exposed not only to all of the light that is coming out of this, even when they do have these little covers on the bottom, you still have a lot of light leaking out, but especially as you're stepping up in power, you're also getting a lot of smoke and soot and exhaust that you're gonna need to exhaust somewhere. Since it's open, you can't really do that. So pretty much all of my testing, I have this set up in a garage with a big garage door open and a fan blowing. A lot of people will build an actual enclosure to put around this, which works, but it still isn't like the best solution possible, which kind of has led me away from recommending these style machines moving forward. The only reason I still want to mention it now is this is basically the only way you can get into a laser for less than $1,000, something that can actually work and it's not just like a little toy. So you can go as low as a little under $200. Autour, that Alfaro line, there's a few different models in there that will work. xTool or Atom Stack is usually what I recommend people towards, mainly that their build quality is a good bit nicer. They're more robust machines for what it is. And they've also been pushing the wattage on the diodes themselves. In this case, this is actually a 40-watt unit. Now, I do this video every year, and I really think this might be the last year where we see like new machines in this category, because over the last year, we've had a ton of lasers that have been released that are fully enclosed, which brings us to our next category. So this is what I'm calling a desktop diode laser. And the big obvious change is this is fully enclosed. It actually has an exhaust fan on the back, and the enclosure can protect you from the light that is emitted by the diode. Now these guys can range everywhere from $1,000 to over $2,000. About $1,500 seems to kind of be the sweet spot. And there's a few kind of big players in this category of machines I've personally done reviews on. One is right here, one of my favorites. This is from Raleigh, the Lasermatic Mark II, great overall machine. And then the xTool S1 is probably going to be the most popular that you've seen. And then you have a machine from Creality, which normally makes 3D printers, the Falcon 2 Pro, which is fully enclosed. I recently did a review of their 60-watt versions. So that's basically the most powerful diode that I currently have in my shop. And then another really popular brand that kind of came out of nowhere last year is WeCreate with their WeCreate Vision. They have a 20-watt version and a 40-watt version. And they also have something else, I think, coming soon, so stay tuned for that. But in general, it's basically like an open diode machine with an enclosure on top. But I found since the price has gone up, they have included some more features with these as well. One of which is a lot of them will have like an integrated camera. That is what is right here on Raleigh. Actually, the S1 is one of the notable exceptions not having an integrated camera, but pretty much all the other ones do. It's got the exhaust system. Some of them will even have an autofocus, so it can help you figure out how thick your material is. Some of them have Wi-Fi, some of them don't. And again, if you kind of want a breakdown of all of those different features, be sure and check out the chart. Now, I've actually done a deep dive into these desktop diode machines and like ranked them all against each other earlier this year. That video is right up there. And the long and the short of it was, this is basically like my all-around favorite. Raleigh's done an excellent job with this machine, but also I use the xTool S1 a good bit too, because of their software and how easy it all integrates. And we're actually gonna talk about xTool here in a second. Now, before we jump into our next category, I wanted to talk about this machine real quick because it doesn't quite fit in with anything else. This is the xTool M1 Ultra, which is technically like a desktop diode machine. This one's got a 20-watt diode on it, but it's actually modular, so you can actually take these guys out. In fact, this is actually a blade attachment that will be similar to like a Cricut that you'd use for doing fabrics or vinyl cutting like that you wouldn't use a laser for. And this is the laser module, which just can insert like that. And this one also has a a printing module as well, which is something you can find from Flux in their ADOR machine, which is also a laser diode with a printing module included. So if like the crafting space, especially the cutting of paper and fabric, is something you do a lot that you can't really use a laser for easily or cleanly, then like a modular machine like this could be a really good option for you. Now, a Snapmaker kind of falls in this category, except they're not really doing vinyl cutting. Their other modules are 3D printing and CNC. So if you want to go on that side of things, that's another 3-in-1 option as well. All right, back to the other machines. Moving along from our Diode desktop machines and going up the chart line, now we've got our desktop CO2 units. And these are probably the most popular just in terms of the videos that you guys like to watch. And behind me, I've got two of my favorites. This is the Thunderbolt, as well as the xTool P2. And like we talked about before, these lasers work completely different than a diode machine. In the back of these machines is the laser source. In this case, it's actually a glass tube that's filled with carbon dioxide, and through a bunch of science and magic, that generates a laser beam. And typically with CO2 units, they're gonna be more powerful than what you find with diode machines. You saw earlier that basically the biggest diode module that we have seen is around 60 watts, which is more than 55 watts. But the 55 is kind of on the low end for the CO2. We'll talk about a machine I have in here in a second that is 150 watts. So it's easier to scale those up in terms of power. Now, looking at the chart, these are typically going to be not as expensive, but also their work area isn't going to be as big because they are designed to sit on a desk versus the other machines we're going to talk about, which actually sit on the ground. Now, the desktop CO2 units are a little bit unique because they have the widest range in terms of price, which kind of also relates to the widest range in terms of features. So actually, you can see right here on the lowest end, we've got the OhmTech Polar, which comes in at about $2,300. So even a price that's getting close to the high end of those desktop diode units. But then you can take it all the way up to over $7,000. That's going to be for like the top end Glowforge, or even some of the desktop units you can find from Aeon as well as Thunder. So this is the original Thunderbolt, but they have, I believe, a Plus, which is like $7,000, and when this one is about $5,500. So the price can definitely get up a lot higher as you're going. And it really is the bells and whistles that's going to distinguish this category from our next one, which is going to be the budget industrial CO2 machines. Specifically things like an integrated camera. In this case, the P2 actually has two, one right here, and then one in the laser itself. Bolt also has a camera right there. Now, even though these desktop units are going to be smaller, a lot of them are going to have a pass-through, meaning you can put bigger material through them. In this case with the xTool, you actually have to buy a riser accessory that you can put that on top of. Then a lot of them will have nice onboard controls. Specifically, the Bolt has this nice touchscreen display, which makes it super easy to use. And usually the design is going to be a little bit more refined and compact, because with CO2 units, you have to start worrying about cooling because those glass tubes will get hot. So a lot of the bigger machines, you'll have these external water chillers, which is just pumping cold water through the CO2 tube. This one doesn't have a chiller, but it does have a water reservoir, and that's actually inside the back of this machine. This guy actually doesn't, and we'll talk about why here in a second, but all of them will have some type of compressor that will give you your air assist that helps put out any flames that are popping up right where the laser is coming out, as well as some type of exhaust fan that is sucking all those fumes out. Now, the Bolt actually doesn't have a chiller, and that's because the laser source on this isn't a CO2 tube. Now, I'm still putting this in the same category. It's actually using an RF tube, which is a sealed metal tube. And what's nice about those is they don't run nearly as hot as the CO2 tubes, meaning you really don't have to have cooling because it has a bunch of exhaust fans on the back doing a great job. Another nice benefit of an RF tube as well is the actual dot size of the laser beam is going to be smaller. So they're typically going to do a lot better job with engraving, where a typical CO2 tube can engrave, but they're really set up to do powerful cutting, which means it's going to trade off the engraving performance for the cutting performance, but it can still do both. Now, looking through the chart on the work area side of things, these mostly fall in the 20 by 12 inch range, with a varying size on terms of the thickness of the material. Most machines actually are set up kind of like this one, minus the riser. So there really isn't much clearance on the inside. You're only talking like 3 to 4 inches max. One thing I like about the Bolt is it doesn't have a riser, but it is really big on the inside. I actually have this rotary already set up inside of it, because if you're wanting to do something like tumblers, no know that the standard desktop setup may not fit, especially those like big fat Yeti tumblers, but the bolt lets you do that right off the bat. All right, in terms of my recommendations and the two machines I actually use the most, it is these two behind me. And it's actually for two different reasons. The Bolt overall is a better machine. All around, the build quality, it's really easy to do maintenance on it. All the components are top notch. It's just a very, very well thought out machine. The P2 is nice as well, but the build isn't quite as good. But what the xTool P2 does have going for it is its fully integrated ecosystem, especially with the software, which makes when I'm having to do something really quick on a laser, typically we'll send it just to this because it's super easy to connect it and get going. Which brings me to the Glowforge question. And for that, let's head back to the studio because it is blazing hot out here. So Glowforge and in a way xTool are kind of separate from the rest of these companies for one big factor, and that is that they have fully integrated software with their machines. WeCreate also has their own software, but it hasn't come as far, especially as what xTool has done. And Glowforge might be the company that you most identify with lasers if you haven't kind of been in this world, because when they first did their Kickstarter for their original CO2 desktop machine, it kind of blew up all over the place. I know I definitely wanted one of those when I got it. And I actually had a Glowforge. I did a review video on it. And it's a good machine, but I wound up giving it away to the local school system because as I got deeper into this, I got nicer and nicer machines. Because I mean, to be honest, Glowforge is like super expensive for what you're gonna get. Like the top end machine is like $7,000 and you can get a lot of a laser for a lot less. But the big selling point on Glowforge is how tight they integrate it into their software, as well as the safety considerations that they take, especially because they're a US-based company. Now, a lot of people hate the fact that you have to be connected to Wi-Fi to use it, but in like an educational setting, sometimes that can be a huge plus because it's easy to connect to it and work with it. But just on like a performance, stats, and value side of things, it just doesn't make as much sense to recommend moving forward. Now, they actually do have a desktop diode, the Aura, as well as the Spark, which is like a smaller version. But again, it's gonna be fully tied into the Glowforge ecosystem, and it's gonna be pretty expensive for what you get in terms of power and performance. Now, that's kind of where xTool comes in. It really picks up the ball that Glowforge had and has run with it, especially over the last like 2 years. The very first machine I reviewed from xTool, they weren't even called xTool. It was MakeBlock, which I think is their like parent company. They make a lot of educational based materials, and a laser cutter and engraver was one of those. And then pretty soon after, they came out with the xTool D1, that open gantry diode machine. And that was the one that really seemed to blow up, where a lot of other companies took notice and we started to see a lot of the same style machines coming out. They didn't stop there though. Then they went on to release the xTool P2, and then it was the xTool F1, a desktop fiber machine, the F1 Ultra, a bigger desktop fiber machine right back there, the M1 Ultra that you just saw, a screen printer solution, all kinds of stuff. But kind of the core of it, and one of the reasons I keep coming back to them, is their software. It originally wasn't that great, and pretty much the industry standard for software across all of these machines is going to be Lightburn. I highly recommend it. It is incredible, super powerful, and it's pretty much what everybody uses. There's free software called RDWorks that most of these machines will work with as well, but Lightburn is what I recommend. I actually have a course on it if you guys want to check it out. But xTool has rolled their own solution, and they have added a lot of features to it, and it's come a long way, even within like the last year. They're able to do stuff with their integrated cameras that other manufacturers really can't, like curved surface engraving, not like rotary, but like if you have like a curvy surface. The F1 Ultra has this like crazy conveyor belt where you can just drop materials on it and the camera can scan it, automatically turn the artwork and like engrave it on, which is just wild. And they've been pretty quick on the feature release process, which has made it a really popular brand, and I've seen a lot of people pick up those machines. And now, as you'll see, xTool in general is more pricey than the competition, but no, you're kind of getting that software back end as well. All right, our next category is our budget industrial lasers. And if we're looking at the chart, these definitely can increase in power, and as we go, we are also increasing in price. But unlike the desktop units, you basically are trading bells and whistles for increased power as well as size. So the price range for these type of machines can kind of track along the same range as the desktop CO2 machines, but you're getting a lot more laser as a result. Specifically, this is a manual focus 60 watt machine from Ohmtech, and the work area on this is 20 by 28, and because it is raised up, you have a lot more distance in the Z axis. But that does come with some trade trade-offs, probably the most noticeable right off the bat, is you normally aren't gonna have any type of integrated camera, although that's a pretty easy and cheap thing to add on in the future. And you're gonna have to figure out a way to pump water through a CO2 tube. Now, a machine like this is basically the very first laser that I ever got. I got it off of eBay, and when I opened it up, they basically gave me an aquarium pump, the little plastic box to pump water through, which worked, but wasn't the best. Now, a lot of times with these machines, they'll recommend buying an industrial chiller, which I have right over here. Not only can contain water like we talked about earlier, but can also chill it down. That will be an additional purchase. And then sometimes also with the exhaust, although they do have a great exhaust fan, there's a 4-inch duct coming over here from the side. You might see people putting inline fans in the ducting system. So this will just attach directly to the exhaust and then suck it and blow it out wherever you want it to go. And you'll have some type of external compressor that is also hanging off the machine. So kind of the drawbacks with these is they just take up so much space for the machine itself, as well as kind of all the accessories that are going around it. So compared to the desktop units, typically the build quality isn't going to be quite as nice. It kind of depends on which one you are looking at, but especially as we move into our next two categories, it's a lot of the internal components and features that are really on the budget end versus what you're going to get on more expensive machines. But if size is the most important thing for you and you're trying to do it on a budget, this is going to be the category for you to check out. And in terms of price, you're like in the $2,000 to $6,000 range for the industrial CO2 units. And really in this category, you kind of have two companies. You're going to have Ohmtech as well as Monport. They're going to have a bunch of different models and versions that are going to vary in size as well as power. Normally the size will increase as you're going up in power, because in the back right there is the CO2 tube, and to get a more powerful tube, it has to be longer. So to have a machine that can fit a bigger tube, they typically will give you a bigger work area. And a fairly recent change on the Ohmtech side is they've kind of rebranded these machines to their Maker series, where you can get like a manual focus machine, which this one is, where I have to turn this knob to adjust the Z-axis, but then they also have autofocus versions as well. That is the one I actually want to compare directly to the xTool P2. Again, the xTool P2 is 55 watts at 26 by 14 inches as your work area, and that is $4,000. Now the Ohmtech AF2028-60 is $3,100, so almost $1,000 cheaper at 60 watts, so a little bit more power, and then 28 by 20 inches, so a much bigger work area, but then also the Z-axis changes a good bit as well. Now, as always, there might be features that matter a lot more than you, and I'm trying to put all of those on that grid that is linked down below. And then in terms of my recommendation, honestly, it would be something kind of like this. I think the 60 to 80 watt range is nice for this, and you're getting a really big work area as a result. And Ohmtech is one that has worked well for folks over the years. Just know that typically the companies in this category, the customer support isn't going to be as great. So when things do break on your machine, just know you're gonna have to get a lot more DIY on it versus some of the other companies we're about to talk about now. All right, we're kind of just shifting down the shop to get to our next category. This is gonna be our high-end industrial CO2 unit. And one of the examples I have in here is the Thunder Nova 24. Now, to this point, we are really getting into the high end on the budget. And if you look at the chart, this definitely is to the further right. You have a range of $6,000 going well over $10,000. And you're actually gonna find a lot of crossover with the budget CO2 units and the high-end CO2 units in terms of raw power. Where this really steps up is it brings back a lot of the features that we saw with the desktop CO2 units, as well as stepping up that build quality. The higher end of the bolt line would kind of fit in here as well, because you really wouldn't put those on a desktop. But basically their bolt line is all of their RF tubes, while their Nova line is all of their CO2 tubes. And this is also where you're gonna find the Nova series from Aeon. Same name, just to make it more confusing, as well as their Supernova series. Actually, earlier this year, I was able to chat with both Thunder and Aeon down at a conference in Orlando. Aeon had just come out with their like Redline series, which is basically like a huge spec bump on their entire line. So that's where you're gonna find a big jump from those budget CO2 machines. Also, especially with companies like Thunder USA and Aeon, their support is excellent. I've actually had support on this machine as well as the Bolt before. They didn't know who I was. I just straight up called them up. So we were doing voice chats. They were calling me over email all the same day. They really can get you up and running. Now, I don't have any hands-on experience with the Aeon series. I do have one coming in later this year, so I'll be sure to update this once I get it. I do with the Thunder. I love the fact that you can basically access any panel on this machine to be able to do maintenance and customer support. It's a really well thought out and tightly integrated system. Now, outside of the desktop diode units, which has just seen like an explosion and really creation of a category in the last year, this category is starting to see a lot of changes as well. We already talked about the S line. I know Thunder has a new Nova 3 coming out, but one company we've actually already talked about has come out with a new line and a brand new Type machine, and that is this massive guy right here from Ohmtech. This is the Ohmtech Pro line. Specifically, this is the 3655 hybrid, meaning it has a work area of 36 by 55 inches. Hybrid means you can actually cut metal. So not engrave, which we're going to talk about more here in a minute, because it's got a 150 watt tube on the back. Just absolutely massive. They have some smaller versions of this as well. But then in this category, but not as expensive, this one is like $13,000. You've got the Pronto series, which basically takes a lot of the internal component upgrades that we are seeing on these higher end units from Aeon and Thunder, and then applying them to the budget form factor that we already had from Ohmtech. So now this is pretty much at the top end in terms of cost. This will compare pretty close to the Thunder Nova 63, which is a machine that has a 63-inch workbed, so even bigger than this. And that one is actually $15,000. And you can find something similar from Aeon as well. Now I'm gonna have a full series of videos about this machine specifically, so we can talk a lot more about what makes a high-end machine, other than the fact it's just a lot bigger. Typically, you're going to be able to run them faster because you're going to have nicer internal components. Sometimes you might actually have servo motors, which are going to be closed loop. In this case, I think the max speed is 1500 millimeters per second, where like the budget industrial end is like the 600 to 800 range. And actually the Redline series from Aeon gets the Redline name because they max out at 2000 millimeters per second, which is just wild. And then a lot of the other improvements are centered around the fact that you are using this in a production environment. Parts are going to hold up a lot longer for a lot more stress, just nicer machines overall. All right, I want to let you in on a little secret. I can't give as many details as I want to. There's actually a brand new laser company that's based in the US that's going to be coming out with some really competitive machines on the desktop CO2 side, as well as like the high-end industrial side. It's going to have the high-end features, but not really at that high-end price. The company is called One Laser, which I think I can say. Hopefully I don't get in trouble for that. They're actually guys that have been around the laser industry for a while, and they even designed some of the machines we've already talked about today. Now, I'll have a lot more details about them in the future, but keep an eye out, especially if you see review videos jump up in the future. All right, let's jump back into it. Now, one category of machines that I haven't been hands-on with are going to be what I call pro CO2 machines. Now, this more or less is merging into the high-end industrial CO2 machines, but specifically, these are gonna be like totally American made. These are gonna be from companies like Trotec and Epilogue. But just know they're the type of machines where you have to request a quote to figure out how much it is, so you know it's gonna be a lot. But that does bring me to our last big category of lasers, and that is fiber machines, which is gonna let you do stuff with metal. Now these work a good bit different than a diode or a CO2 machine. So even if you're using a small diode or a big glass CO2 tube, it's still gonna be a gantry that moves around your workbed and either has the actual diode on it, or is a series of mirrors that reflects down through a lens that then fires your beam. This is not how these work. Instead, a lot of them will come into two different sections. This one actually puts both of those sections together. So this is like where the laser is generated. Then it travels through this fiber optic cable up here, and there's a galvanometer right here and a lens, which just reflects back and forth super, super fast to fire your beam down. And this is a 60 watt unit from Monport, and this is the xTool F1 Ultra, but these are actually a good bit more expensive. And while a lot of people will say fiber, they are referring to a machine like this. No, you can actually get a fiber source, which is what can actually mark on metal, and you can put it on a gantry style machine. There's actually a lot of manufacturers, they'll give you an IR diode module because these are still generated with a diode, just a different wavelength. And specifically with this one, I think this is like a 2 watt one from xTool that you can drop onto the D1 and move this around, and other manufacturers will have something similar. This is only going to be the case for diode machines. So CO2 machines you don't really retrofit. But a Galvo system or form factor like this isn't just limited to like a fiber metal marking laser. This is normally the form factor you're going to see a UV laser in that we talked about way at the beginning. And then also you can buy a CO2 laser source that you tack on a galvanometer to where then you get the benefits of the super fast marking speed. And outside of the fact that you can do metal, that's the big difference between this and pretty much all the other types of machines we've talked about, is just how fast these things can mark. So remember in the CO2 machines, like the top end speed for the Redline series from Aeon was 2000 millimeters per second. This like budget end fiber, just the standard F1 from xTool, has a top speed of 4,000 millimeters per second. So twice the speed, and that's really on the low end. This F1 Ultra tops out at 10,000 millimeters per second, and then you can go like even higher from there. Now, in terms of recommendations, I would say if you already have a diode machine or you're planning on going that direction, I would think about doing one of these IR modules that you can interchange, because kind of the cheapest you're gonna get into is not this one specifically, but something kind of in this form factor is going to be from AtomStack, and that is just under $1,000. That's the AtomStack M4. Also, the Gweek G2 is going to be pretty similar as well. Now, one kind of gimmick that a lot of these manufacturers will do, especially on the lower end, is not only will you have the fiber source for metal, but you also have a standard like purple diode laser that you can mark on everything else, like wood and all that kind of stuff. And then you can change in between. So the LaserPecker 4 can do that. The xTool F1 and the F1 Ultra both have two different sources that it can cycle between. But as you kind of increase in price, you're gonna get bigger and bigger units. Then you're gonna get into more power, as well as things like MOPA fiber lasers, which basically opens you up to a whole nother range of frequencies where you can do wild stuff like color engraves directly on metal. But that's like a whole other conversation that I need to make a dedicated video for just these type of machines. If you wanna go on the pro top end, CloudRay is a great company to look at. Or if you want a dedicated unit, stuff like the LaserPecker or the xTool F1, if you like using their software, could be a good one to go. Just know these are like still in the $1,500 range, so they're still not cheap. Now, a lot of these companies we've been talking about, I've got discount codes set up through. So if you click the link down below to get to the chart and the grid of like all the different machines we've talked about, I'll also include any promo codes that I've got in there as well. So hopefully this helps you narrow down your decision. If you guys have more questions, I would love to help out the best that I can. Let us know down in the comments. All right, until next time, go make or break something in your shop. See you guys.